I'm going to date myself. Boy, that's as smooth as Karen Carpenter, isn't it? Yeah, y'all are dating with me, aren't you? I don't think she would sing a song that lovely. Hey, that was good. It's good to be in God's house, isn't it? I have enjoyed so much studying the life of Joseph and preparing messages to bring to you. And I think where we left off last time, Joseph was thrown into a pit by his brothers and then sold into slavery by kinfolks. You know, the Ishmaelites or the Midianites, whichever one of those tribes you want to pick. I think it was sort of a combination of both. You know, all of those people are descendants of Abraham, just like Joseph was. But those blood ties didn't seem to matter any more then than they do now. And so as a result, Joseph found himself sold to a man in Egypt named Potiphar. And in chapter 39 of Genesis, we read what happened. Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. And the Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. As master saw that the Lord was with him, how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and became his personal servant, and he made him overseer over his house, and all that he owned he put in his charge. And it came about that from the time he made him overseer in his house and over all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned in the house and in the field. So he left everything he owned in Joseph's charge. And with him there he did not concern himself with anything except the food which he ate. And the fly in the ointment is, now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. And thus we read the opening verses of the Potiphar affair. The Potiphar affair. I think that's a good title for this message, because Joseph's time with Potiphar proved to be a time of further testing from the Lord. Now, when we talked about Joseph last time, we discussed him being a problem child and all the things that he did wrong to cause his brothers to be jealous, envious, hateful toward him. Yet, in all the things he did wrong, we found that God blessed Joseph. God continued to pour out his grace and mercy on Joseph. And because of that trial of being cast into the pit by his brothers and sold into slavery to kinfolk, God seemed to use that to temper Joseph a little bit. Because you don't see anything in this passage about Joseph complaining to God, crying out to God, moaning and groaning about all the injustice that took place in his life. He just seemed to be able to adapt to whatever circumstance came his way. And I think many of us can learn from Joseph in that regard. God is with his children. That is the most noticed aspect of Joseph's life to me. At every turn, the writer of Genesis declares God was with him. God was with him. God was with him. And he even tied the prosperity that came to Joseph and to Potiphar and everybody that was around Joseph. Everybody did better because Joseph was around. And the reason they did better because Joseph was around is because God was with him. Even Potiphar observed that the Lord was with Joseph. So the presence of God with Joseph enabled him to adapt to many tremendous grace. Even so much that when he was sold into slavery, he was willing to be the Egyptian's slave. He became Potiphar's personal servant. Now, I don't know much about servanthood, but I do know something about serving. And you see, all of us are supposed to know something about serving. If we know Jesus as Savior and Lord, if we have agreed to follow Him, then we ought to know something about serving, because He came not to be served, but to serve and to give His life a ransom for many. Jesus' whole life and ministry is characterized by serving. And I think that's a real key to the presence of God in our lives. When God is present, we don't turn up our nose at service, no matter how menial it may seem, and it doesn't go to our head no matter how exalted it may seem. I know sometimes service is more noticed than at other times. It's easier to notice the preacher because he's always babbling in front of you, you know. It's easy to notice the singer because they make such beautiful sounds. It's not so easy to notice the nursery worker or the kitchen committee or the baptism committee, unless the water happens to get cold or something. You know, those unnoticed services are still service and are based on the presence of God in one's life. The presence of God is such a cherished promise. Jesus gave that to His disciples in His closing Great Commission. Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. His presence with us should make a difference. It certainly made a difference in Joseph's life. Whether it was good circumstances or bad circumstances, the presence of God was a continual blessing on his life and on the lives of everyone he touched. Notice also in this story that Potiphar became a more prosperous man when Joseph came into his life. The blessing of God on Joseph spilled over onto Potiphar. Now, Potiphar was not a watermelon salesman by any chance. I don't know why we use that to talk about poverty, folks. You know, we talk about folks who didn't come into town on a watermelon truck. I'm telling you what, if I had a truckload of watermelons, I might be a pretty wealthy man today. Have you bought one of those things lately? So I heard about some folks who were selling watermelons and they're going in the hole on every sale. It's costing them more to buy the watermelons and take them to sell than they were getting for them. You know, one of the guys turned to the other on one of the trips and said, you know, I've finally figured out how we can make this thing work better. I said, how's that? He said, we need to get a bigger truck. Sometimes our schemes for prosperity don't work out, but Potiphar merely had to associate himself with Joseph in order to get in on the blessings of God's prosperity with him. Now, we need to be careful that we don't teach a prosperity religion, because that is really far from the gospel of Jesus. However, there is a truth in the Bible that God prospers His people. God prospers His people. He knows what we need. He provides our needs. The Bible never claims that God will bless us with more than we need, and yet most of us are blessed far beyond our needs, aren't we? But to say that we are more favored by God because of physical, material prosperity, I think would be a falsehood. For many people who suffer dire poverty because of their faith are honored more by God than those who have plenty. The point is, when we so demonstrate the presence of God in our lives, even lost, unbelieving